Back when automotive dinosaurs roamed the earth, like the Nissan Cube and of course the Honda Element, Kia decided to try their own boxy practical vehicle, the Kia Soul. And this is the only one really left on the market. Now we're seeing it in its third generation, the all-new 2020 Soul. This generation is coming complete with a 3-line powertrain lineup. So we have a gas engine, a turbo engine, and a full electric version coming very soon. Today we're taking a look at the turbocharged engine and then the base naturally aspirated engine as well. The overall look up front changes depending on the version of the Soul that you get. This is the all-new GT line, so this is the sportiest version of the Soul. It has a variant of the same overall grille shape that we found on the last generation model, but it's been enlarged and made a little bit angrier in this generation. Kia tells us that this is still a tiger nose grille because they have this little indent right there and of course down there at the bottom, but this is definitely a tiger that's been crossbred with something like a big mouth bass. The headlamp change is one of the biggest differences up front versus the last generation. We have these very sleek, slim LED headlamp modules here, 2 modules for low beam, 2 modules for high beam, and then they're tied together with this plastic strip that runs right across. Moving over to an X-Line model, we have a slightly different treatment to the grille right here. We have fog lamps down at the bottom instead of in this area, because this area is full of the halogen headlamp that we find in most trims. Instead of the LED headlamp modules, we get incandescent parking lights and an incandescent turn signal up higher on the front. So in my opinion, you really do want to step up into the models where we get the upgraded headlamps, because the lower end version looks a little bit like the last generation Jeep Cherokee in terms of its overall front end design. I should apologize now for the wind noise in this video. It is incredibly windy out here in Southern California, where we're being able to take a look at the 2020 Soul. So I apologize for that right now. And as a result, I won't be walking around the car too much because it's shielding me from the wind. At 165.2 inches long, this is a little bit longer than the last generation Soul. So we still get the same sort of length creep that we see in other vehicles out there. But surprisingly, Kia has actually kept this to a minimum, because this is only about 4 inches longer than the original Soul back when it first started. This is still very solidly a subcompact vehicle in America, and it's still definitely very square, as you can see. The extra length versus the last generation model seems to have gone almost entirely to the cargo area right back here in the back. In terms of overall comparisons, this is a little bit shorter than something like the Toyota CHR, which I suppose you could call a competitor to this, and a full 20 inches shorter than the average compact sedan in America. Out back, we find a little bit more of a departure than the front or the side profiles. We get what Kia is calling a boomerang style tail lamp design. I actually find the old generation Soul a little bit more attractive back here. These are partial LED elements, so the turn signals and the backup lights, which are right over here on the hatch, are incandescent elements. Everything else that you're seeing is an LED element. The overall styling back here does change a little bit versus the X-Line and of course the base model as well, since we are driving the GT line. But if you want this center dual exhaust, then you have to get the 1.6 liter turbo. For this year, you can get the GT line, which is the sportier looking trim with the 2-liter engine, but you can't get that center exhaust with that particular model. Kia decided to kill off the 1.6-liter naturally aspirated engine from last year. So things start out with a 2-liter 4-cylinder engine that's essentially borrowed from the Kia Forte. It produces 147 horsepower, 132 pound-feet of torque, and it's mated to either a 6-speed manual in the base trim or a continuously variable transmission in the other trims. The big impact of that is that fuel economy has significantly improved over the last generation model. As many of you know, overall fuel economy and cabin quietness haven't exactly been Kia's forte. Then we get this optional engine right here. It's a 1.6-liter 4-cylinder turbocharged engine, produces 201 horsepower and 195 pound-feet of torque. This engine is not mated to a manual transmission, however. It's only mated to their new 7-speed DCT that we find in a few other vehicles from the Hyundai Kia Motor Group. Coming a little bit later in 2019, there will be a full electric version of the Soul. It'll produce 201 horsepower and 291 pound-feet of torque. It's the same electric drivetrain that we find under the hood of the Hyundai Kona and, of course, the new Kia Niro EV as well. It's mated to a 64 kilowatt-hour battery pack, and they're telling us you should expect 243 miles of electric range. Even though this generation of the Soul is a complete redesign, the front seat dimensions have remained exactly the same as the outgoing model. So we still have a very generous amount of headroom. Even with the seat not on the floor up a little bit, as I tend to prefer to drive, I still have about 2 inches of headroom left, and this model does have the moonroof. We also have a lot of legroom here for a small vehicle. Back at home, I have a 6'5" person and a 6'6" person that are available in my office to test and put in vehicles and see how they fit. And even our tallest people have no problem fitting inside our current generation Soul. That is exactly the same thing that we see here in the new Soul. With the seat all the way back in its tracks and down, you can see that there's definitely a lot of legroom, and we have a tilt telescopic steering column, which makes it easier for shorter and taller drivers to find a good driving position. This model has the electric driver's seat with a 2-position lumbar support, but no memory here in the Soul. Hopping into the back seat, things feel again very similar to the last generation Soul, but if you look very closely, you'll notice that we actually have lost a very small amount of legroom versus the outgoing model. It's only about 1/10 of an inch. That means that in terms of overall legroom, this is still significantly ahead the vast majority of subcompact crossovers, hatchbacks, or sedans available in America. Sitting right here behind myself, I still have about 4 inches of legroom left and a very generous amount of headroom, about 3 inches or so. If I move over to the middle seat, even though it's a little bit higher off the ground, I still have about 2 inches left, and then all the way over to the right side, again, still several inches left, even though this front seat is now all the way back in its tracks. This is actually one of the few subcompact vehicles in America where you can very easily put 4 full-size adult guys in and not have a problem. They'll be fairly comfortable for a trip to lunch. The one dimension that has changed significantly versus last year is hip room, which is around this area in the cabin, as well as shoulder room. And that seems to have to do with the way that the doors and the vehicle itself has been shaped, because in terms of exterior dimensions, this is about the same size overall width as the last generation model. But the extra width does mean that it's going to be easier to put child seats in the back or adults, especially if you are going to try and squeeze 3 people on this bench. Cargo capacity and cargo practicality have long been selling points for the Soul, and that continues in this generation. One of the reasons that this got a little bit longer than the last generation model, and of course one of the reasons that we have a little bit less legroom than the last model, is that they prioritized expanding the cargo area back here. And we now have over 23 cubic feet of storage space, which is up from 18 in the last model, making this even more practical. This is actually about the same kind of cargo capacity that you'll find in some compact crossovers, which is the next category up from this in terms of overall size. But size is not the only consideration for this cargo area. I have a 22-inch roller bag here. This is the largest one you can carry on a domestic flight. You can see that it fits very easily here right behind the rear seats, whether the seats are folded or whether they're in their upright position. And thanks to the extra length we have in this generation of the Soul, you can now stack them on top of each other and get another 22-inch roller bag right back there. You can also put them in this position and line them up across the back of your Soul. You can fit probably about 4 or 5 of them right back here. Now they won't quite fit under this cargo cover. It is a rigid style cargo cover, but you could pull this out and just set it right on top of the luggage and the rear gate will still close. The load floor is latchable in 2 positions. There's a lower position right there, which gives you maximum cargo capacity, and then an upper one right here, which gives you a level floor, so that way you can push luggage right there onto the rear seat backs. Pulling the load floor completely out of the way, you'll notice that we actually have a spare tire under here, something that we're not seeing in all of the competition, and we're told to expect the ability to put one in the electric version of the Soul as well. It won't be standard, but there should be room under there to put one if you want to aftermarket. The rear seats fold in a 60-40 fashion, almost completely flat, and you'll see that they fold flat with the cargo area load floor in the upper position, not the lower position. On the inside, the biggest change versus the previous generation of the Soul is that we no longer have a panoramic moonroof available. We just have this pretty standard sized moonroof in the top end trims. And that really does change the overall feel of the interior. The panoramic moonroof was really one of my favorite options in the previous generation Soul. It really made it feel an awful lot more open for the rear seat passengers. Now again, we do have an incredible amount of headroom in this vehicle, just doesn't feel quite as open and as airy if we don't have that glass panel on the roof. Kia tells us that one of the reasons they removed the panoramic moonroof was to improve the overall structural rigidity of the vehicle and, of course, reduce the curb weight, which helps improve fuel economy. So I suppose those are fairly decent trade-offs, although I really do like that large glass moonroof. We have adjustable shoulder belts for the driver and front passenger and 2-way adjustable headrests. Because we're in the GT line, we have this combination of imitation leather going on here and fabric in the middle of the seats. Since we're driving the GT line, these seats appear to be a little bit more firmly bolstered than the regular versions of the Soul. And as we move on over to the door panel, you'll notice that the overall style and character of this interior has definitely changed from the last generation model. This feels more grown-up and definitely more European. We have more straight lines going on the door panels. We have a 3-speaker setup right here. There's a center speaker right here, right by that armrest and the door handle. We then have a larger woofer down there at the bottom of the door, and then a tweeter integrated into the dashboard in in this top-end model, which does feature the optional Harman Kardon audio system. Kia has not abandoned the mood lighting in this cabin, but they have definitely changed it. So instead of the speaker grill down there at the bottom of the door getting the mood lighting ring, we now have this one right here, sort of in the middle of the door. There's that grab handle right there for the door itself, and then the ring travels around right there. We have a little Soul logo right down there at the bottom of that ring, and you can just barely see the area that lights up. There are a few more options for that lighting. This section of the door right here with this pattern on it also lights up at night. I'll hopefully be able to stick in some pictures of what that looks like so you can get a better idea. Moving over to the dashboard, again, the overall design is definitely a little bit more grown up, a little bit more restrained than the last generation of the Soul. And if we move over here to the touchscreen infotainment system in the middle of the dashboard, we find a module that actually looks a little bit BMW or perhaps Mini to me. This is the optional 10.25-inch infotainment system. 7-inch system is standard with Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, and in the upper end trims we get this new widescreen format, which is a little bit different than what we've seen before. The widescreen format allows us to access Apple Maps in this widescreen look right there, which is a nice touch. And then the home screen has been modified for this larger screen as well. We're going to get a 3-screen layout there. You can also swipe over and see our integrated apps like the sound mood lighting, where we can definitely have more control over this than in previous generations of the Soul. Below the infotainment screen, we have a few physical buttons down there. Dual zone climate control rather than single zone climate control, which is another nice touch. There is a wireless charging mat right there below those controls, and then a storage area where we also have a USB input and some charging ports. A pretty typical console shifter, drive all the way back there, manual mode over to the left, engine start stop button, that is optional. Base models will have a key. Heated seats, ventilated seats do not appear to be an option in this generation of the Soul for the moment. Drive mode button, heated steering wheel. We then have 2 cup holders right there between the driver and front passenger seat. Pretty traditional handbrake, which is a touch that I actually appreciate. You can expect the EV to get an electric parking brake. The center armrest here is wrapped in the same fabric that we see the seats wrapped in, and then we have a moderately sized storage cubby right there in the middle. Another new gadget in this cabin is the availability of a heads-up display, again only in the top-end trims. As we see in the Hyundai Kona, this image is projected on a sheet of plastic that comes up from the dashboard. You can actually press a button to lower that into the dash. The downside to this is that it doesn't project the image as high on the windscreen as the systems that project on the window itself, but this is a little bit less expensive, easier to offer in less expensive vehicles like this. The instrument cluster is styled very similar to the outgoing model, with basically the same sort of controls here. Certain vehicle settings are done through this display in the middle. We also get trip computer information, turn-by-turn navigation directions, and the status of the vehicle's active safety systems. All versions of the Soul get a new steering wheel, and the one that we're driving has this flat bottom design right here that I find really attractive. It's nice, thickly rimmed. It also has some aggressive sport grips up top, and in this model is heated as well. There are definitely a ton of buttons on the steering wheel. In sort of a horseshoe shape, we have the buttons that control the cruise control system. This model has the optional radar adaptive cruise control system. This button right over here, completing the circle, changes the display on that LCD between the speedometer and tachometer, and then we use this toggle and OK button to actually interact with that display. On the left side, we have the buttons for our infotainment system. Volume up, down, mute button right there in the middle, track up, down, dedicated phone buttons, and then a mode and voice command button. To the left side of the wheel, we find the buttons for the blind spot warning system, lane keeping assistance system, heads-up display, and a button to turn on and off the auto start-stop system if you don't want that feature enabled. Fortunately, Kia had some of their lower-end trims to take a look at. You can see that the overall design is very similar, although we don't have quite all the nice touches that we found in that upper-end model. This one obviously doesn't have that Harman Kardon audio system, but we have very similar trim style going on over there on the doors and on the dashboard. The biggest change in the dashboard is that the infotainment system becomes a smaller screen. So this is the one that you'll find in the base model. It still features Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, something that we see across the Kia lineup these days. We have a manual single zone climate control system right down there. This model does not have a wireless charger, but it still does have a storage shelf. USB input and charging ports right there. We have a similar shifter, manual mode over here to the left as well. Blanks where we would have found those heated seat controls and the heated steering wheel control. 2 cup holders right there in the middle, and then the armrest that's not quite as dressy. The overall steering wheel design is very similar, but it doesn't have the flat bottom. This one does have the optional leather wrapping that you can see there. The base steering wheel would be a urethane model. The buttons on the steering wheel itself are basically the same, but no paddle shifters on the back like we find in that top-end turbo trim. And then the multifunction LCD between the speedometer and tachometer becomes a black and white model rather than the color display that we saw in the other version. So today out here at the Soul launch, I have my friend Sofian with me, who we've been driving around here today with the new 2020 Soul. And the first thing that you'll notice right away is that this is quieter than the last generation Soul, which again, I already own. I have a 2016 Soul EV. And that actually surprised me a little bit because Kia hasn't really been known for creating vehicles that are terribly quiet in their segment or terribly efficient. And they're trying to change that with this 2020 model. Let's get our 0 to 60 estimates out of the way right up front. Again, you will have to wait till we have this for a complete week so we can do our usual battery of tests. But based on the fact that this basic same engine and transmission are used in the Forte, I'm going to go ahead and guess this is going to be about 8.3 seconds 0 to 60. So a little bit faster with the 2-liter engine than the last generation model. Keep in mind that this is about 300 pounds lighter than the last generation 2-liter turbo Soul. So even though we have a little bit less horsepower, I expect it's actually going to be a little bit quicker, or perhaps possibly around the same 0 to 60 time. If you upgrade to this turbocharged model, I'm going to go ahead and guesstimate 7 seconds 0 to 60, just a hair faster than the last model, because over here in the 1.6-liter turbo, the weight drop is only about 150 pounds. And then most likely, if you get the EV version, that's going to be the fastest. Based on our recent experience with the Nero EV, this should clock in right around 6.6 seconds 0 to 60. So if you want the fastest, but not necessarily the best handling Soul, that's actually going to be the electric one now. Now let's talk about overall handling. We have basically the same size tires on most versions of the Soul, but again, we have that weight decrease. So you should expect absolute grip numbers to be improved, but I think the biggest difference really is the overall feel, don't you think?
Yeah, it definitely feels like the structure is much more rigid. Kia said it was 35% more stiff, I guess, than your generation. The steering I thought was much improved. And the suspension, I don't know, they said it's sport tuned for this one, but
this definitely feels a little firmer.
Yeah, you mostly just get a much more confident drive. Like, it feels like it's a little bit more better built and more rigid.
And one of the things that they've told us about that rigidity is that's why we don't have the panoramic moonroof up there anymore, because my Soul EV, now that it has about 20,000 miles on it, it does definitely flex when you get the car in off-camber situations, and so the rear hatch tends to have a little bit of a squeak to it, kind of like an old minivan.
So basically, Alex, you're very sad that there are no more big sunroof.
But I am sad, yeah, because personally, I am willing to have the squeaky rear in order to get the pano roof, because it really does make it look bigger and feel bigger inside when you open it. But for handling, it definitely has a positive improvement. This definitely feels neater and tighter and a little bit more communicative.
Yeah, I definitely noticed, even like when the sunroof, when the shade was open, it doesn't feel quite as airy at times.
Yeah.
Like when you had all that light come in, because this car only offers a black interior, when you could open up that roof, it just made the cabin feel even more spacious on the inside.
When it comes to the overall ride, keep in mind that we are driving the sport-tuned version of the Soul, so this is a little bit stiffer than what we expect to see in the X line especially. As with all small cars out there, especially ones with short wheelbases, there is kind of a little bobble-headed feel in the cabin, just like you'd find in a Fiat 500 or a 500X or any of these other very small vehicles. You go over a bump up front, there isn't quite enough time for the overall suspension to settle itself before the rear suspension impacts that bump. So it definitely has that small car vibe that some people like, some people don't like.
Well, yeah, and keep in mind that if you guys don't get this GT line, if you go for like an LX or the S or the EX, you'll have smaller 16 and 17-inch wheels. So that will probably improve the ride quality for those of you who favor more comfort.
Yeah, those wider profile things. And of course, interestingly enough, if you get the EV model again, we actually get an independent rear suspension in the back. Kia tells us that was due to overall packaging to accommodate the battery, but they've also claimed that it has a positive impact on the overall handling and ride feel. Now, one thing I liked about this one is that the suspension is definitely less upset in bumps around corners. If you're really starting to push this hard, the suspension just tracks right along. It's actually surprisingly fun to drive for a big box.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely no Soul GTI, but it's definitely the most fun that you're going to have in this strange, subcompact crossover segment.
And that is another question: is what exactly is the Soul? Is this a boxy hatch? Is it a brick with wheels? Is it a crossover?
We were kind of like disagreeing on what this competes with, like, because Alex had mentioned that some people might cross shop it with like a Fiat 500X or a Mini, and I'm kind of just like, I don't know. I mean, the top sales in this segment is the Crosstrek, the Renegade, and the HR-V.
Yeah, and in my head, the only one of these things that's like the other is the HRV, because the Renegade is the off-roady one.
They're also different.
Yeah, and the Crosstrek is big, and
Bigger.
it's a compact hatch that's been lifted. One thing that I really like, though, that we talked about a little bit earlier in the video, is that the overall room has not gone wrong in this generation of the Soul. That's something that we've seen in redesigns, complete redesigns of some competitive vehicles out there, is that in the next generation, they're just not as practical as the former generation. And I'm happy to say that we have actually an improvement in cargo area without sacrificing too much on the inside in this one. That really is a personally impressive thing for me.
Yeah, and what makes it more impressive is this is on an all-new platform as well. So Kia was able to preserve all that extra space of the old one, but make the car nicer to drive. But we don't have any of those sacrifices, because we just got back from the Corolla drive, and that was considerably smaller.
Yeah, a little tighter on the inside. And this one is actually related to the Hyundai Veloster and, of course, the Kona. And we get that same 1.6-liter turbo under the hood. And what we're talking about noises, it doesn't have that same sort of sensation, that same sort of sound that we see in the Veloster. It's just sort of some four-cylinder engine under the hood. Yeah, it's a little buzzy. But the performance is good, just that the exhaust note is just not there, you know, to the same extent. Fortunately, out here in Southern California, Kia didn't just give us the 1.6-liter turbo to drive. We were also able to get the volume model, which is this 2-liter naturally aspirated engine and a continuously variable transmission. It's likely that 90% of Souls sold in America will have this combination of engine and transmission under the hood. Overall 0 to 60 performance, as I said before, should be quite similar to the Kia Forte. The Forte is not exactly swift for the compact sedan segment, but that particular 0 to 60 time is actually very good for the subcompact crossover or subcompact hatch segment. When you compare this against the likes of the Nissan Versa Note, the Honda Fit, the Honda HR-V, the Toyota CHR, etc., this actually is a pretty good overall 0 to 60 time. That's because even though we have a little bit less power than last year, we have a new transmission, Kia's latest continuously variable automatic transmission, and we have less curb weight than the last generation Soul as well. In this particular model, the curb weight reduction is over 300 pounds, and that is a pretty big difference. As we've noted in the Kia Forte, this particular transmission changes ratios much faster than most of the CVTs out there. This actually is much more engaging to drive, especially than the Nissan CVTs and also the Honda CVTs that we find in their smaller vehicles, because we don't find exactly the same continuously variable transmission in the Honda Fit that we find in the Honda Civic. The big difference that you'll note between this and the Toyota or the Nissan CVTs is the time it takes to change ratios. So if you want to drive in a more spirited fashion, for instance, as we round this corner, if you wanted more acceleration and you punched it, we get what feels more like a traditional automatic transmission shift. There's a moment where not a lot's going on, it changes ratio, and then you're off to the races. Very much like what you see in a traditional 6 or 8-speed automatic transmission. Now, if you're driving the Soul gently, very much like the Kia Forte or any vehicle with a CVT, the engine just sort of loafs around there at a particular RPM, and it's just varying the ratio as you're driving along. That's the big reason that this generation of the Soul gets significantly better fuel economy than the last generation. Now, in terms of overall fuel economy improvements, the big reason that the turbocharged engine gets 1 mile per gallon improvement over last year is they've added auto start-stop to that engine. We also have it in this model, but unlike some General Motors products, you can actually turn it off in the Soul. So if you don't like auto start-stop, you can hit the button over there, turn it off every time you start the car, and you won't ever have to worry about that system. The only other real difference that you'll notice between this and the 1.6-liter turbo model that we were just driving is the overall ride quality. This suspension is a little bit softer, but the difference is not night and day. This particular model that we're driving right now has 18-inch wheels on it with the same size tires that we saw in the GT line. So overall grip levels are actually going to be fairly comparable. Stopping distances are likely going to be a little bit longer because this does not have the upgraded brakes that we find on the turbocharged model. In an interesting twist, if you get the GT line with this engine, not the turbocharged engine, then we don't get the brake upgrade in that model. And I think that is a bit of a pity. I wish that Kia had just put the same brakes on all the GT lines regardless of the engine choice under the hood. The most likely reason for that is that Kia is not treating the GT line as just a top-end performance line. They're sort of forking off the Soul lineup at the bottom end of things. So we have a very, very base trim for the Soul. It's the one you're going to find the manual transmission in. Then we get the next trim level up, and that next trim level up, you can choose between the GT line if you want the GT line styling on the outside, but you don't get that center exhaust setup. Or you could choose the X-Line, which is what we're driving right here, and get a little bit more of a rugged exterior design, but the overall feature content doesn't really change. So it's not like the GT line gets you extra goodies on the inside. You will still have the smaller LCD and that base GT line trim, etc. To sum everything up, if you liked the old Soul, you're going to like this model better. This is definitely neater and tidier. If you didn't like the overall feel that you get from a vehicle with a small wheelbase, however, this isn't going to quell your fears. It's not like they've turned this into an ultra smooth, long highway cruiser, but I've always liked the way that the Soul has packaged everything together, and I think the overall ride and handling trade-offs I think are very, very well done in this overall. This is usually the point where we start talking about pricing, but unfortunately we don't know all of the pricing details for the new Soul yet. This will start at right around $17,500. That's the only price point that we actually know. And then Kia tells us that the top end trim for the moment should be under $28,000 before destination. And this is likely going to be the model that they're talking about right here, the 1.6 liter turbo with all the features that we've been looking at today in this particular video. Now for 2020, the big thing to know is that the 1.6 liter turbo appears to only come fully equipped, whereas in 2018, the vehicle was available in lower end trims with the 1.6 liter turbo. So while the base model seems to be a fairly reasonable $1,000 bump when you consider all the standard feature content we get in that base trim versus last year's model, this one does appear to be a pretty significant price bump over the 2018 model year vehicle, about $4,000 or so. As I usually say, you will have to wait until we can get our hands on one of these for a complete week so we can run it through our usual battery of comparison tests, but I can tell you right away that I like the new 2020 Soul. This is still the practical, solid vehicle that we've seen out of the last two generations of Soul. We still have an incredible amount of interior volume and interior legroom, headroom, etc. for a vehicle that is very, very small. Overall rear seat accommodations especially are definitely more comfortable than we find in the Honda Fit. The rear seats don't move in that same magic seat configuration that we see in the Honda, but I prefer the overall room and overall space in here over to what we see even in the Fit or HR-V. As we've seen with other generations of the Soul, we also still have their long standard factory warranty and a decent amount of standard feature content as well. A 7-inch infotainment system with Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, a tilt telescopic steering column, and that practical storage area in the rear. In addition to that, we have some upgraded materials even in the base model versus the last generation Soul. And because this vehicle has lost weight over the previous generation model, we also have improved overall handling ability and improved overall handling feel thanks to just the overall design of this third generation model. At this point in time, we don't know exactly how much the Soul is going to cost, but this is still one of the less expensive entries in this particular segment, and if Kia can keep top-end prices under $28,000, it also means that this 1.6 liter turbo is still a really interesting and unique option, because nobody else in this segment really offers extra power versus what we see in their base model. So if you want a higher horsepower version of an HR-V or a Chevy Trax, you just can't find one. That means that the only true competitor to this top-end 201 horsepower turbo model could be seen as a Mini Countryman or a Mini Clubman, which are going to cost you significantly more in order to get the same level of performance. Also, an interesting twist for 2020 is that the electric version is going to be the fastest version 0 to 60. Under 7 seconds is what we should expect out of that model, although handling is not going to be as good in that model as this one because of the overall tire size. With all that out of the way, be sure and hit that subscribe button down there at the bottom of your screen so you can be updated on all of our latest videos, including the upcoming video just as soon as we can get our hands on a model for a complete week. We will also have a video on the Soul EV over the next few months here. Click up to the top of your screen if you want to support this channel, and of course find us over at facebook.com/AlexNautos so you can see what I'm driving this week.